This episode of the podcast is being sponsored by my friends over at Real Mushrooms, realmushrooms.com, my friends Jeff and Sky Chilton. I had Jeff on the podcast. He's a really fascinating guy. I was really happy when they offered to be a sponsor. They sell medicinal mushrooms, things like reishi, chaga, cordyceps, turkey tail. I think many people are now familiar with the amazing medicinal qualities of mushrooms. They sell an amazing product. It's 100% organic. It's the actual mushroom, which is unlike a lot of companies that are either not organic, they don't actually use the mushroom, they can have fillers, they're potentially using the mycelium on grain, and that's in the final product. So really high quality product. It's the only product I use. I think they're just doing amazing work. As listeners of the podcast, you can receive 25% off of your first order if you use the discount code UNIVERSE at checkout, and I think you'll be really, really happy with their products. On this episode of the podcast, I sat down with Thoryn Stephens. Thoryn's a really interesting guy. He was introduced to me. I listened to an interview with him, which I really enjoyed. We sat down and spoke about his background, interestingly, how he came to huachuma or San Pedro early in his life and how that had a formative impact on him. Eventually, his journey into molecular biology, his path with human optimization, really, I think, spawned by his interest in marathons and eventually becoming an Ironman participant. We spoke about AI, about BCIs, invasive and non-invasive therapies, kind of how that can impact human optimization and the medical industry. We spoke about AI, consciousness, a lot of really interesting topics. So I think and trust you'll really find this conversation interesting. As always, if you're able to support this podcast, that's a really big help to me. Patreon is a really beautiful way of doing that. I really like that website because it's based off this idea of reciprocity. So if you feel like you're gaining something from this podcast, that's a really good way to give back. There's different tiers you can sign up for, and also those tiers give you different things back. As always, thank you very much to the people supporting that way. It means a lot. If you're interested in working with myself and my colleague Marav Artsy, we have our 2026 schedule up now on my website. So if you're interested in working more deeply with plants, we have some really beautiful opportunities. You can find out more information on my website at nicotianarustica.org. And then finally, if you're able simply to help with the algorithms, it's also always super beneficial. So if you're viewing this on YouTube, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video, and if you're listening on Apple Podcast or Spotify, leaving a starred rating and a short review. So I think that's it for the intro, and without further ado, here is my conversation with Thoryn.
Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out of the maze today. Running out from the maze. Running out from the maze, running out from the maze today. I'm running out from the maze, running out from the maze, run out of the maze today.
Well, Thoryn, thank you so much for coming on. We were chatting a little bit before we started recording. I think we'll have a lot to talk about. I came across you. You were recommended to me. I think you have a really fascinating life story. It seems like you've done a lot just in the realm of consciousness and in the business you're created. Perhaps some of the audience has heard of you. I'd imagine a number of people haven't. I know it's always a big question, but can you speak a bit about yourself, about your journey in life and who you are, what you do, and kind of what happened in your life to get you to where you are now?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jason. Honored to be here. So to start, I calling from Colorado, was born here in the Rocky Mountains, but grew up in San Francisco. Very much in the heart of Silicon Valley, where most of my friends went into computer engineering. I went into biotechnology, so very much always interested in science, and then so growing up in the Bay Area, again, very much a technology haven. I think one of the most influential parts of my childhood was going to the upper Amazon of Ecuador when I was 14 and drinking huachuma for the first time. I was on a school trip, and we snuck away and met some hippies, and ultimately we're looking for psilocybin mushrooms, and we met some locals, and ultimately that was my foray into huachuma, and then really into plant medicines. And that was back in the 90s and kind of the beginning of the internet. And so I was ordering all types of plant medicines off of the internet and the dark web, and really experimenting at an early age. And that was really my foray also into consciousness and consciousness expansion. Fast forward, my education is in molecular biology. I studied biotechnology, and I worked in drug development for many years before I ultimately moved into data science. And the common thread was really human measurement, and measuring whether it was on a molecular basis. I was part of the team that basically genomics based essentially science. So we were genetically modifying different organisms, with the vision of drug development, essentially looking after like novel proteins and mechanisms of actions. And but it was really through that experience and just the idea of measurement and optimization that's really been the common thread throughout my entire career. And ultimately, I am in Colorado. I left LA in California during the pandemic and have settled here in the mountains. And I run a company called Brain.One. And Brain.One is focused initially in neurological optimization through health protocols. And now we're really looking at the whole human in different aspects of human health, including women's health as an example, really with an evidence-based approach to how we utilize essentially human health protocols. So we'll take a scientific paper, summarize them, and then make those available for people to use. So that's kind of the quick summary, and happy to go deeper in any of those areas.
So I think today a lot more people are familiar, because you started off saying when you were a younger man you found yourself in Ecuador working with huachuma. I think that's a plant that people are familiar with now. It's more common in the public vernacular, but at that time probably no one you knew what that word was. How did you find yourself in Ecuador? How did you find yourself in the mountains there, and how did you end up finding huachuma at that age?
Yes, so I read the teachings of Don Juan when I was around that age. I was given to it, maybe a bit earlier actually, like 13, but 13, 14. I was given a copy from my father, and actually have his original copy. And so the concept of consciousness was always top of mind for me. I also had an older sister living in San Francisco, so we were going to see the Grateful Dead and going to raves and things of that nature at a pretty young age. But the teachings of Don Juan was very pronounced in that kind of early period of my life. And within the book they talk about three major medicines. One, of course, is peyote. And so the foray into like mescaline and peyote. The other is datura. And then also psilocybin are really the three that he covers. And I studied that book intently. It's actually written about a native named Cuchora. That's Don Juan's true name. His name is Cuchora. He still is living in Tecate, Mexico. And so it's a beautiful book. It was really the first book written by Carlos Castaneda, and the only one I ever really gravitated towards. But that book, again, really allowed me to understand the different types of plant medicines that were out there. I'd also mention, that book really it was published in 1967. It put peyote into the consciousness of the world, Western, the Western, mindset and so forth. But that was kind of the impetus essentially. And so I was on a school trip. I went to a boarding school, and we were fortunate enough to be, every year we would do a foreign trip into another country. And so that was kind of the opportunity essentially.
And what was that, like obviously experiences are so personal, so only sharing what you call, but at such a young age and being in a foreign land, being in the wilds of Ecuador, I would imagine probably the mountains, the Andes there. When you experienced that, I mean, was that something quite novel to you? I mean, did that have quite a significant impact in your life of what that experience kind of arose for you?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, traveling at that young age and going to a third world country and being deep in the upper Amazon, we were in a town called Cabamba, which today is now like a, tourist hotspot. I think it's considered a blue zone. A lot of the natives live to like over 100. And so that experience was amazing. And, like a little bit more to the stories. So, I met these, traveling, travelers essentially. And I was like, hey, is there psilocybin? And they're like, no, but there's huachuma. And, time slowed. And they're like, find the blue door in town. And so the next day, a friend and I were like going through these cobblestone streets of the town, and we found the blue door, and we knock, and this old man comes out who was like, arguably 100 years old, and he knew, and, we basically bought these green bags for like, it was like 10,000 sucres, which was like $3 at the time. And then we went into the jungle, and, we were staying in these bungalows kind of offset, but fairly deep in the, ultimately in the Andes and upper Amazon, of course. And it was incredible. And that was we drank, and where a lot of my friends were much more in the party vibe. We actually went hiking into the jungle, in the middle of the night. And what I really learned and found was consciousness within myself, but also within, the jungle. And that was really the biggest learning. And, something that's really permeated, to this day.
It's interesting because Don Juan, I think, had such a big impact on so many people. Often, I think, kind of like in a revisionary way of looking at it, people have pointed out discrepancies in the timeline and maybe some of the teachings, but I think perhaps they're also missing kind of the overarching picture and idea behind it. But I think anyone who's gone fairly deeply into some of these medicines, that book really resonates as true. I mean, it very much is a map into a certain way of viewing the world. Is that something you still think about or ponder or come back to the teachings of Don Juan?
Certainly. And what's so unique about that story, so again, I have a very, I'd call it a multidisciplinary approach to plant medicines and, from huachuma to also, the Native American church. And I've been sitting with a group of Native Americans in California going back well over a decade, probably 15, plus years now. And one of my good buddies, Adam, 3 years ago was like, hey, did you read the teachings of Don Juan? And I was like, yes, of course. And he's like, well, do you want to come to Mexico to sit with Cuchora? And so 2 years ago, I sat with Cuchora, who is the Native American who is literally Don Juan. At the time, he was 110. I think now he's like pushing 111 years old. And so I actually went and sat with him twice and drank, had medicine and sat in TP with him. And that experience was much more profound than just the book. I mean, the book is beautifully written, but his knowledge of plant medicines, supersedes most humans alive on the planet today. And that was just a very unique experience. And unlike, he's 100 at the time initially, 110, right? And we were under, in his olive grove, under an olive tree, and he did essentially a Maya reading, and it was just incredible. And he wasn't like hunched over and, da-da-da. I mean, he was like, very strong, and it was an incredible experience. And he actually does a pilgrimage every year with the Wirikuta, and that is a pilgrimage with peyote, essentially going from the coast to the birthland, or the, the native land of peyote. And so, anyway, side note. If you or your listeners are ever interested, I'm happy to make an introduction, but it's an incredible, incredible experience.
And so what was I believe you said you studied molecular biology. What was the impetus for that particular field?
Sure. So studied molecular biology. my family are farmers fundamentally. I mean, we breed horses. And so we had a farm in California, and we bought a large farm in Lexington, Kentucky. And so at that point, I knew I wanted to go into science. I wasn't sure exactly what, but there was a calling there, and there's always been a calling within plants in general. And so initially, I just basically moved to Kentucky to support the family, and jumped directly into molecular biology. That was the calling, and I was working in a plant physiology lab, essentially as an undergrad, working towards graduate classes, debating on a PhD in that whole realm, and but working closely with plants actually, and that was kind of the beginning, and ultimately got my degree, and then I jumped directly into drug development as a molecular biologist.
And it's always very curious because on the one hand you have people like Brain.One, who's working with plants in an indigenous way, a certain cosmovision, that the plant in its entirety, its holistic medicine, the rites, the rituals, the stories, the dances, everything around it. And then you also have this emerging field of Western pharmaceutical drugs, even what's now being called like the psychedelic renaissance, specifically with certain substances. What is your view of the pros and cons of each? Because often there's certainly a lot of crossover, but there's also still almost two camps also. I mean, there are people who cross over between the two, but it is almost still two different worldviews, a more traditional way of looking at things and somehow isolating something, synthesizing it, using it in a laboratory setting, using it for very specific outcomes. What have you kind of found or discovered being in both of those worlds?
Yeah, thank you. That's a thoughtful question. I think of science as another interpretation of reality, ultimately. And I think that is the kind of the connection to spirituality. And at some points they do begin to blur. There's studies when you start looking at like, Newtonian physics and, string theory and things of that nature where, again, there's a little bit of blurring and we can't explain everything. But I've always thought of, again, plants as a catalyst into consciousness, accelerants, and but then what you also find out is you don't even need the plants. You can find the same through breath and meditation and prayer and whatever that looks like for the individual. But I guess just fundamentally, that's how I've always thought of science versus spirituality. It's just another interpretation of the world, ultimately.
And what was that like for you, that time in your life of being a biologist? Were there certain projects you were working on, certain things that you found, you discovered, like not only in the external but also kind of internally for yourself?
Yeah, 100%. So we were, the generation that sequenced the human genome. That was like in the 2000s. Craig Ventnor, the Human Genome Project. And so I was a molecular biologist. We were really kind of at that, the vanguard. And really with the vision of curing human disease through your genomic data. And that was a bit short-sighted at the time because you have, in the gene expression model, you have DNA makes RNA makes proteins. And, the idea that we could solve, let me just reframe it. What we really found is, of course, it's not just your genome, but ultimately your proteome. And your proteome is the expression of you, like you're, literally you as a human, you're a makeup, essentially. But in between, you have the epigenome or epigenetics and then the transcriptome. And so it was just a really interesting time in science and honestly very exciting. This was even pre-CRISPR, so this is the early 2000s. And it's really, it's opened up so much now. People, your audience, I'm sure nearly everyone has heard of epigenetics and that concept, which really is the regulation of your DNA. And that can be through DNA methylation, through histone modification, things of that nature. But ultimately, that was kind of the epiphany, is that it wasn't just your genomic data, but ultimately the regulation of your DNA. And a fascinating kind of step forward to what I'm doing now is that you're given a genetic, again, blueprint, but your gene expression can be dependent on your microhabits and the things that you do in your life. There's an incredible study that came out. It was called The Lancet. You can Google it, The Lancet 2020. It just came out again last year, The Lancet 2024. But it outlines essentially a dozen modifiable risk factors that are based on your, essentially things that you do that can prevent dementia. And it's very, it was really a landmark study because what it started to elucidate is that you can ultimately change your gene expression based on your environment and based on microhabits and things that you do every day. And that's very profound. And so kind of an amalgamation of what I've been, worked on in my past and what I'm working on now with Brain.One. But that's ultimately the concept. Again, microhabits, microbehavior changes, modifications. Drinking ayahuasca could be a microhabit. Doing psychedelics, could be considered a microhabit. But then looking at it holistically across all the things that you do on the day-to-day. So that's been quite profound.
Could you elaborate a bit more on that? Because I also grew up in that time when the genome was mapped, and what I remember very clearly from that time, and it seemed very incorrect to me, was this idea that everything was genetics. Now that it was mapped, like everything could be understood and reprogrammed and boiled down. And it did seem to take away this idea of volition, of the human being, the human experience, all the things that we bring to it. Obviously, there's been a lot more study now, and I think, again, talk in the common vernacular about epigenetics. But could you maybe elucidate a bit more between those two polarities of like what are things that maybe you've seen or science in general about the role of the genome versus the role of these more mutable epigenetic factors?
Yep. Yeah. So I always try to oversimplify. Again, your DNA or your genotype, your genome, that's your genetic blueprint essentially. However, again, you can have a genetic predisposition. If we look at Alzheimer's as an example versus dementia. So if you have a genetic predisposition for Alzheimer's, unfortunately today there's nothing we can do to essentially solve the disease. What we can do though is change the onset or the progression of the symptoms, so things like the tau proteins that ultimately cause the onset of the disease, memory loss, things of that nature. And so the high level, concept again with epigenetics is that you can control your gene expression. And DNA methylation is a good example, and that could be dependent on the things that you do on the day-to-day, your daily routine. So we spend a lot of time. We've analyzed, thousands and thousands of research papers in every protocol ever written on human longevity, as an example, like literally. And we've gone through thousands. Now we're looking at literally getting millions of papers, essentially citations into the system. But that concept of, again, the human having the ability to change their gene expression based on the things that they do. And now that's pretty widely accepted. Again, 20 years ago, it wasn't really widely known or researched, but now, there's a good amount of data around this. And so, some of the rough numbers around this, roughly 30 to 60 to 70% of your gene expression can be dependent on your environment. Now that's dependent on the tissue, it's dependent on the cell. So that's very much a bit of an average. But the bottom line again is this, and if you go back to that Lancet 2020 paper, we can control our gene expression to a degree, is really the takeaway there. And those are by the things that you do. An example could be cold plunging. I'm a big fan. I live here in Colorado. I go in the river and it's roughly, 36 degrees in the winter. But I know for regulation of my autonomic nervous system and my parasympathetic, given stress and other things going in my life, that's a very easy, immediate microhabit that I can utilize to ultimately regulate my nervous system. And so that's kind of a direct example. Another one could be the concept of neuroplasticity. So we spend a lot of time studying this and the concept of brain fitness, where your brain is not we believe it should not be thought of as just a static organ but ultimately, with the really the explosion of understanding of neuroplasticity, we can continue to retrain it. We can continue to rebuild neurons and, essentially the circuitry of your brain. And that is ongoing into your 80s, and 90s, some of these studies have shown. And so what is an example? Learning a language, when you're getting into your older ages, or even learning an instrument, those are very direct examples of your microhabits, of the things that you do that are changing ultimately your gene expression, and in some cases rewiring your brain and, really helping promote neuroplasticity. So this would be a couple of direct examples.
It's interesting you use that idea of cold plunging. I think that's, again, something more people are doing. What is, from your understanding, what is happening with that? Because it's interesting you use that it would help if you have, for example, stress in your life. But the act of cold plunging in itself is stressing the body. So how does that equate to actually helping with short-term or long-term stress?
Yeah, funny anecdote. I was with a buddy of mine. He's a finance guy. We're here in Colorado. We were driving to Crested Butte. And he was going on and on about work, like his, default mode. I mean, he just couldn't stop talking. And he was like complaining and da-da-da. And I pulled over and I was like, get out of the car. We're going in the river. And, this is high mountain, roughly 12,000 feet. And it's freezing. And this is in the middle of summer. You still have the snow runoff and so forth. And he gets in the water and literally, he just, immediately, his physiology ultimately changed, and he just completely calmed down and was able to recenter and focus. And so, from a physiological perspective, it does stress the body, but it also, in that stressing, it allows you to really just refocus your nervous system. And for me, it almost feels like a vacuum, and it can be 60 seconds, 90 seconds, depends on, how cold the water is and a number of variables there. But it allows you to basically like reset automatically. And so that's just what I've seen firsthand. And so as part of my daily routine practice protocols, that's one of the microhabits that I follow pretty regularly, ultimately.
You mentioned neuroplasticity, and that's something that I would imagine is a big part of your focus, especially with your company. It's also something that's, I think, focused a lot on now in terms of kind of this world of biohacking, but also in science and also interestingly in plant medicine. Like a lot of the studies of various plant medicines also really show these ideas of neuroplasticity, even neurogenesis. Is that something you can speak about more about that idea? Again, I think it's a phrase that people are familiar with, but like sure. What's actually going on? How can these neural pathways be either regenerated or recreated or freed to be able to operate in a new way?
Yeah, 100%. So again, our perspective is that the brain is an organ, and like any other muscle in your body, it needs to be continually exercised. And, those exercises could be something like learning a new instrument, learning a new language, or it could be doing a brain training game, as an example. But ensuring that your mind is constantly, active is just one of the kind of like the broad terms that we strongly believe in. And then secondly, the concept of, building essentially new neural pathways. So your brain, and there's studies around this going, into the very later stages of life, while it's, it's really, accelerated when you're younger, of course, it doesn't stop. And so that concept of following protocols, and we have these available for free that we're happy to share, but that can help stave off dementia, as an example, there's a lot of data around this. And so those are things that we really try to evangelize. And so these protocols can, contain essentially things like the tips of microhabits that I just mentioned, that people can follow to continue to, strengthen their brain into their later, later stages and ages of life.
What do you think is happening? I heard you speak about this on the other interview I listened to. These cases where someone is struck by lightning, or they have a hard fall, or there's some kind of traumatic impact, and then they're able to speak another language or play an instrument that they've never played with. Like on a physiological level, on a neurological level, like how would that be possible to essentially like be open to a new way of being in that way?
Yeah, actually, I have an interesting anecdote on that. I was speaking at a longevity conference on Necker Island last year, and it was a really interesting group of humans, and ranging from Harvard professors all the way down. And one of the guys that was there was a former banker, and he smoked 5-MeO DMT and became a physics savant, and instantaneously like was able to write these papers that were peer reviewed at scale. One of them was one of the most cited of all time, and it was actually after smoking 5-MeO DMT. So I thought that was very profound. I can't say, I don't know the mechanism neurologically of what's happening there, but in this instance, through the use of this medicine, this human instantly was able to understand these concepts in physics that he had. I mean, he was literally a finance guy, no idea, and and I think it was literally only one time he actually experienced it. So I think it's fascinating to know that we all potentially have that that opportunity to step deeper into consciousness, whatever it might be, that there could be a deeper calling or understanding.
I think one of the things you were mentioning of how you got interested in maybe for lack of better words, this idea of human optimization was your interest in kind of extreme sports, of things like Ironman and marathons, things like that. What was that experience like for you? Like what, because those are things where obviously like small differences can have a pretty big influence. Like often the differences between first place and 10th place can be even, a matter of seconds or minutes or something. So what was that kind of pushing yourself to these extreme conditions? Like I'm sure that was very like shaping of your interest in human optimization.
Yeah, I was athletic when I was younger, but I was not. I wasn't overly competitive. I went to a high school where there was a lot of U.S. ski team and Olympians, and at one point I was debating, is there a future there for snowboarding specifically? And then I became a molecular biologist. And so it really wasn't until I was in my 20s that I got into more endurance-based, essentially sports. My mother actually one day we started trail running together, and it went from 10Ks to half marathons to marathons, and then ultimately to triathlons and then full Ironmans. And through that experience, I really began to see how you could, related to the prior points, I could optimize my biology through data. And so back then, we wore these big, like bulky Garmin watches. And it was through the use of heart rate and then ultimately heart rate variability, but heart rate in particular, that I began to see how I could optimize my biology by attenuating my lactic threshold if I went, stronger, longer in this particular, direction of my training. And that was a bit of an epiphany, and really has led me to my current work in the use of data. But that experience in particular was very, very profound, and it really spanned a number of kind of directions in my life. But I always come back to the concept of using data to measure and then optimize, which is again led me to my current work with Brain.One. But that, yeah, the use of data in particular was a bit of an epiphany.
And how do you either currently or in the future foresee data being able to optimize human health?
Yeah. So what I see is like the vision around human data specifically is the use of what's called multi-omics. And so we touched on this earlier, but the concept of genomics, proteomics and again the transcriptome, the epigenome. And when you really think about, again, we talked on drug development and the really understanding the full totality of the human. It's really through that concept. So it's kind of the North Star, in my opinion. Most people haven't necessarily heard of multiomics yet, but it'll become, I think, more and more prevalent. But where we're at now is there's really no shortage of data, that could be gleaned. Normally I'm wearing a Garmin, a Whoop, or a Apple Watch. At Brain.One, we have over 300 integrations of different wearables. And these are, essentially signals that we can use to understand our biology. And, one of the most prevalent is something like a metric, like heart rate variability, as an example. Do you use any wearables, Jason, offhand?
In general, no. I do have an Apple Watch, but the only time I wear it is when I go on a run, and I just measure my how fast I'm running.
Yeah, I mean, people always ask, they're like, what's the number one microhabit, for longevity? And it's generally understood as sleep. So I have an Apple Watch. I don't sleep with it because it's too bulky, EMF, all those things. I try to minimize. But I use an Oura Ring, which is a very smal device. Side note. And so Apple Watch is great though, and the number of metrics you can now get of Apple Watch, I mean, it's pretty much astounding. And these devices continue to get smaller and more accurate. And so, we use essentially these different types of data sets to optimize our biology. I use it specifically in things like training. So if I'm training for a triathlon or like a snow-based race here in Colorado. And then also use them just for my kind of day-to-day management. And, again, sleep as an example. I had a mentor in analytics once who, had the comment, you can't manage what you cannot measure ultimately. And so I believe without becoming over-measured, and there's a point where, you can measure too much. You've got like the Brian Johnsons of the world, which, if you're familiar with his work, he's measuring absolutely everything. I think he's over here, the majority of humans, I think 1/3 of the US population have wearables today. I'm probably over here, maybe more in the middle, a bit over more to the right. But I believe there's a lot of knowledge and ultimately insight that can be gleaned from the proper use of data. It also can be, you have to be a little bit careful so you don't wake up in the morning and you look and you're like, oh my God, my sleep score is down. I'm going to have a horrible day. You have to really check in with yourself first and see where you're at and then utilize the data, and that can help inform your decisioning. But those are some of the ways I tend to think.
So with that idea of like training, for example, like what are certain data, certain protocols that you found from these wearables that can be beneficial for someone to use and to know?
Yep. Yeah. So for training, I was actually just recently working with an amazing woman named Amanda Powell, and I was looking to support some of my personal digestive issues. And so she's an Ayurvedic practitioner, and we did a full analysis, and then she came back with a protocol, which included a number of traditional Ayurvedic, essentially microhabits, and then nutrition. And that's what I've actually been following in my day-to-day here in Colorado as like kind of my daily protocol. And then I would use data, and again, just fundamentally, if you oversimplify it, you have sleep and activity. You mentioned you use your Apple Watch for activity, very common. I usually use a Garmin for activity because it's more accurate, and then I use a Oura Ring. I've been testing the Whoop for sleep because it's again fairly smaller device. And so, using the data, it just helps inform, again, your baselines for things like sleep. So what is your overall sleep score? What does your resting heart rate look like? What does your HRV look like? And then can you start to see improvements over time, again, based on your training, based on your recovery, based on your, those specific microhabits, as an example. And so what I've seen empirically is, I know I'm not a big drinker, but I know if I drink a glass of wine, I'm going to impact my heart rate variability or my HRV, like guaranteed. I mean, literally, on the daily. So that would be one example. But I also know, if I start to do other, microhabits, so I do like hot Pilates regularly 3 to 5 days a week if I can. And that's with the sweat and the exercise. And I always know after hot Pilates, I see improvements in my HRV. So that'd be kind of two counter examples.
I think one of the interesting maybe ideas of that technology is also being implemented in the medical field. Where do you, I mean, where is that at now, and where do you see that in the probably the near future?
What specifically?
Just in terms of like optimizing health in terms of, there's things like CRISPR, there's things like Elon Musk is talking about brain implants.
Yeah.
There's already research into, as you said, like possibly alleviating dementia, things like that. So
Yeah.
on the one hand, there's more maybe like common things of, okay, like this is going to help with my athletic performance, which obviously is correlated to health too. But then there are like maybe what could be seen as more specific medical related things, like someone's a quadriplegic and they can't move. Like, is there a way to manipulate their brain, which I mean, already that's happening. I have an uncle who has I guess it's a form of neuropathy, but kind of a shaking tremor. And they went into his brain and used some sort of electric stimulus therapy, and it essentially has removed, I don't know, but let's say like 90% of the tremor.
Yeah, amazing. Yes, I think the world of BCI, brain computer interfaces, is extremely exciting. So at Brain.One, one of our lead scientific advisors is a scientist named Dr. Galen Buckwalter. He's very well cited. He's an amazing, sweet human I've known for decades now. Galen was the former chief scientist at eHarmony, so he was doing production level AI and machine learning going back decades. That team, very, very early on in the matching of humans, essentially. And Dr. Galen also is a quadriplegic. And to your point, he had a tragic accident when he was 17, and he jumped off a bridge with some friends and hit a rock, and he's been in a wheelchair. And so he qualified for a BCI clinical trial. So again, it's a brain-computer interface. Neuralink, Elon's company, is a good example of what's considered an invasive BCI, where they're literally drilling a hole in your skull, and then they're deploying essentially a chip. And then they're recording, or in some cases, excitation, of that particular area of the brain. Galen is very much a pioneer. He has 6 BCIs, invasive BCIs, technically, and they are the BlackRock Neuro Utah Array. So if your listeners are interested, they can do some more research around that. And what it's doing is it's a matrix essentially of an 8x8 array, and it's literally a chip on the brain. And it's both recording data on a single neuron basis, which is just mind-blowing, and then it's also allowing for excitation. He has 1 on the prefrontal, which is very, very pioneering, and then he has 5 in the neocortex. And so in that example, Galen is helping lead the science around understanding how he can use his brain to quite literally, control a robotic arm is one of the trials that they're looking at right now, and this is moving really, really quickly. And it's really amazing work, and it can help both humans who are dealing with some sort of debilitation, but also will be used in the real world. And so, an example, there's a number of what are called non-invasive BCIs. And that could include just EEG, just the measurement of your brain with a, essentially brain cap as an example. But there's now also these headbands that you can, find online. And they're not super expensive, $200 to $300. And it's just the beginning. But the vision there is, you could be typing an email and do it 3 times as fast because it's combining your essentially ability to type with, the biofeedback of what it's getting out of the measurement. And then it's essentially helping you type the email quicker. So that would be like a very immediate practical application. In the case of Galen, it's, to really help people who undergo these tragic accidents. But that's all, very, very exciting research. And I think certainly where we're seeing kind of this, amalgamation of both biology and machines. Literally, it's happening right now. To your point, and it's exciting and equally terrifying, but certainly, going to become more commonplace in the future.
I always found it fascinating. You'll watch these older films like Star Wars or Star Trek, and they're set in the future, and yet when you look at the technology, it's already antiquated, even though it's supposed to be set in a period further than when we're set in not in all regards. Obviously, the spaceships are we still haven't achieved that, but some of like the computer screens or the cell phone kind of technology. Obviously, it's so hard to predict things, I think, for that very reason, because things move so fast, they can move exponentially fast, and we still tend to look at things from the lens that we're familiar with without necessarily seeing things from another lens, so you can't then necessarily see the world from that lens. Because you're in this field, and you said things are changing so fast, where do you see this going? I mean, even that idea, I think people probably hadn't even considered that. Like, I could have some external device, some non-invasive device, and that would accelerate me typing. Like, what do you think are the potentialities, and how do you think that's going to begin to manifest? Again, people may think of some external device or eventually glasses, but do you think, I mean, that again seems like a very still present day way of looking at things. I mean, do you think it's even moving to something to where, I don't know, it's even hard to say, but just like something that's beyond even what we're considering now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think today, the concept of we are the generation. We're seeing the amalgamation of biology and machines. So I only see that continuing to proliferate and becoming more commonplace and easier. And there's tons of scientific, Black Mirror type, stories around this, like getting chips and the ability to not just measure, but ultimately to download, languages and martial arts. And of course, that was obviously shown in the Matrix. We're not there yet, but it's not that far away. I think on the drug development side, we have advances with gene editing and CRISPR as examples that are going to also become more commonplace and cheaper. And I'm optimistic about that area, relative to like the the kind of the foray of continuing to help humans in drug development in that area. I mean, there's some really interesting work happening with, in the kind of the intersection of biology with things like organoids, where quite literally, you can take brain cells and create these mini synthetic brains. So I think that's, an area where it's going to continue to be equally, interesting and also potentially terrifying relative to this, the synthetic biology side of the house, where we can, create essentially organs that are completely functioning from, tissues that basically have not existed.
I would imagine like the idea of ethics is something you've considered, and it's obviously it's such a deeply personal field. There's different societies have different ethics, but it was interesting. Even with the birth of my son, I found it quite fascinating in that one of the things they tested for were things like Down syndrome, and I had a great uncle who had Down syndrome, and I just remember he was always such a joy to be around, and certainly different life, difficult life, but like someone who had a tremendous amount of intelligence as well. At the same time, I was listening to an interview with, it was a British guy who's considered an expert in autism, and the interviewer kept asking him this question, like, if like, obviously, where does autism come from? And then if you're able to see that, if there's some specific thing that you can isolate that, and you were able to prevent that, would that be a good thing? But his answer was really no, like, you shouldn't prevent anything. Like, even someone who's highly autistic, their life is valuable, and I think that's a valid point. At the same time, it was very interesting reading the comment section, because there was a lot of parents who had highly autistic children, like kids who had to wear helmets and just needed 24-hour-a-day care, and obviously their quality of life wasn't so good.
My sense would be that most people, if they were able to prevent that, would choose to. But for you, where does this question of ethics arise? I mean, once you start replicating organs, and it's such a big question. Is that something you've considered? How do you see that playing? Is that something that will be more in a free market system, or based on the company? Do you think there will be government oversights of that? Like how does that begin to unfold?
Yeah. Let me answer it first from my personal experience around data. So as I transitioned out of biotech and I was working in technology, I was living in LA and worked for a number of great companies over the years. And this is in the early, let's say 2012, 14. And I was working as a data scientist, so I was building digital systems focused in human measurement. And what we found is that you could optimize any human behavior essentially online. And back then, the Facebook and the Twitter APIs were open. You could literally download the entire social graph from Facebook at the time. And what I began to see working in this space was how nefariously the data could be used. There's a movie that came out called The Perfect Weapon. It's on Netflix, recommend watching. And it really talks about the beginning of cyber warfare. And again, misinformation and disinformation and how it's ultimately been used. But it really talks about the progression of these algorithms as well. And so from that perspective, what I began to see was, we're the generation that gave away all of our behavioral data, and we did it, again, early, early 2000, well, let's say late 2010 to 12 and so forth. Social media, behavioral data, and we did it under the guise of connecting, but ultimately the data was not really used for just connections; it was used for ad serving. And it's become a multi-billion-dollar empire essentially, and so from that perspective, I began to become extremely concerned with how data was being collected and ultimately utilized in data governance and privacy, and it's tricky because on one hand you want humans to make their own decision around their data, and they should have their own autonomy, but ultimately people don't necessarily know or understand. And so, we gave away all that behavioral data to connect with, kids from high school and junior high. But it really opened up, I think, a much larger problem. And now we're seeing this today, with the younger, children and their use of social. And I think it's actually quite tragic. And so that's kind of my perspective on that side of the house. And I think it's ultimately up to the human how the data can be used. And it, can be challenging because on one hand, you want humans to protect their data. On the other hand, you have a slow of innovation. And you could compare, to certain countries like Estonia, where they really just, they have a very much more of an open identity graph. And when you have that openness, then you have interoperability of systems. And, if you look at the U.S. healthcare system right now, most systems cannot talk to each other. You don't have the interoperability of data. And that's due to lack of standardization, but it's also due to privacy. And so, it's a challenge, but ultimately I believe the human, should have the autonomy to decide what happens with their data, fundamentally. There are organizations out there on the brain side that are really thinking about this. One is called the Neurorights Foundation. They're an offshoot. They're out of Columbia University, and they're really thinking about the protection of neurological data. As an example, we talked about BCIs. I did an EEG brain mapping here at a coffee shop. It took 20 minutes. I got about a 25-page PDF relative to my brain scan and the different, the electrical impulses throughout the different areas of the brain and areas I can optimize and so forth. Humans have no idea what to do with that data, and ultimately, how is it protected? And I'm not conspiratory, but there's a number of articles around, big data coming after, the brain data, which kind of is the next frontier. I think there's some truth to that, but fundamentally, we were the generation that gave it all away. So I'm optimistic there'll continue to be better protections around this data. In California, you have CCPA. Nevada has legislation. Of course, in Europe, you have GDPR. But the use of brain data in particular, and then biological data, is also very much top of mind. One other concerning trend that I see, Jason, is humans don't necessarily care about their health records, their biological data, and they're uploading it directly into the LLMs because they are looking for, again, a health protocol, or they're looking for a better understanding of their condition or their children or whatever it might be. And so all of that governance goes out the window. And so this isn't a problem I was looking to solve, but it is something that we're looking to address because it's now so prevalent. And I've talked to advisors in their 70s and younger humans in their teens, and again, they just don't necessarily care because they're looking for an answer they're not getting from their doctor. And so this is deeply concerning. There's zero governance, there's zero privacy. You have no idea where your data is going, but ultimately, this is a trend that I see on a weekly basis right now.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic. I mean, I think also maybe for a lot of people, it came up during COVID because a lot of people obviously have very different feelings about that. But I remember being in Peru, and essentially you weren't forced, but you were very much coerced to get vaccinated. I mean, you couldn't go into public spaces without getting it. And Peru does have everything centralized, so it's on a database. It's very easy to check. One of the interesting things about the U.S. is, as you said, it's not centralized. I mean, still the way the states is set up is, we even call it the states, is a certain degree of state autonomy. Even the COVID vaccine card was a piece of paper, like it wasn't, there's no digital code or something. Yeah. So there is a safeguard in that. At the same time, as you said, there can be a downside to that too. So obviously the data question is a big one. You also mentioned, I think, something that a lot of people potentially have concerns about, which is perhaps with these more invasive therapies. On the one hand, similarly, like I think almost anyone would argue if you're quadriplegic, like absolutely, like especially if that's what that person wants, like that technology seems like a godsend, or dementia, or so many, a host of health ailments. At the same time, this was, time is funny. I don't know how many years ago, but I want to say 5. It could have been 7. I don't know. But there was a journalist, and it got some publicity in the U.S., and he was involved in some case against the government, if I remember, and his car crashed and he died. And the official report was that he had been drinking, but all of his family and friends said he didn't even drink. And so there was, again, kind of this more conspiratorial thought that actually his car had been overridden because he had, one of these like Teslas or something that could be remotely controlled. I have no idea the validity of that. But at the time, I think not many people believed that because it seemed quite foreign. But fast forward to today, if that same story came out, I think a lot more people would be open to the possibility that that's at least a possibility. Very well could not have happened, but at least it seems more possible, feasible. Okay. With those invasive technologies, because you mentioned some of these more terrifying Black Mirror type scenarios, like what are for you some of the potential downsides, or some of these like more terrifying things that you're potentially speaking of?
Yeah, I have an anecdote. My father, he has sleep apnea, and he qualified for a trial, and they put this like fairly gigantic device under his skin. And, it was to help him essentially, like it sends a shockwave, so when he is having issues with breathing during sleep, long story short, it was destroying his quality of life ultimately, and didn't really help with like the underlying issue of the sleep apnea. And so he got it removed. But I think and actually I'm seeing this also with peptides right now. So again, I'm an endurance athlete. I've been using peptides for decades. People are getting overprescribed peptides, and so I think one downside is that people could be overprescribed these devices that they don't ultimately need. That's just something I've seen firsthand. But like on the peptide example, I use them when they're needed. But just like anything, I was chatting with a woman here a couple months ago, and we're talking about her health routine and regimen. And she's like, "Oh, you're on peptides. I'm on peptides too." And I was like, "Great. What are you on?" And she had a list of 9 peptides. And she was a woman in her 60s, and she was very healthy. But like that to me is absolutely absurd. And like there are very few humans that need to be on 9 peptides, and then you're dealing with the liver toxicity and the downstream ramifications. Like it's insane. And so I think that's one example where I think that there's a potentially just immediately, the opportunity to get overprescribed or, maybe to, go down a road that, is not in the best interest of your health. And, there's ultimately another mechanism behind it. So, certainly any electronic device has the opportunity to be, potentially hacked. So I think that's also, a relevant concern. I can't speak to the safeguards of, what Tesla has done to, kind of fortify against those types of attacks and that capability. But, I think it's a fair concern to bring up and address.
One of and I think this was something you spoke about in this other interview I listened to you, which we're moving into a fascinating time with the emergence of all of this technology. There's also this aspect of artificial intelligence, and it's something that even 5-10 years ago I think wasn't spoken much about, but it's a big topic now. I mean, I think a lot of people are familiar with it. A lot of people are using it to varying degrees. How do you see AI coming in with the interface of a lot of these non-invasive applications, invasive applications, and I mean it's obviously a huge question, but just the human being in general, and what AI means for that relationship to the human being.
Yeah, I'm generally an optimist at heart in all things. I think, again, AI is equally exciting and promising as it is terrifying. But I believe, again, as an optimist, it can really be used for good. And, we're already seeing a number of examples of that. So, I've been working with AI for over a decade. I mean, I think I have some case studies from about 10 years ago where we were, more using it on the side of like content generation and UX testing and things of that nature. Again, you have people like Dr. Galen who, has been building these algorithms really for decades now. It just continues to get cheaper and more accessible. And I think there's definitely negative downsides to that. What you tend to see in work environments are people are utilizing these LLMs to do their jobs. And, whether that's, an email or a deck or, whatever it might be. And oftentimes what I've seen is that because of the hallucinations, you end up getting what's called AI slop. And, there's just a lot of junk that's being generated now, both on the personal side, but also on the business side. And then further, there's, some recent studies around this where people are like not as neurologically active when they're, relying on these AIs and LLMs. And it's not surprising because you're not really having to think. And so with all things, I think there's protocols you can follow, that really strengthen how you can utilize these tools. I mean, I think every single listener here, really needs to be up to speed on what's happening within these tools and utilizing them. And, the difference is, like, let's say you want to write a paper on neuroplasticity, you could just ask the LLM to come up with, what is the topic and da-da-da. What I've seen, and this is what I think the smarter college students are doing, is they're using LLMs to then like edit and proofread. So they're coming up with a topic, they're doing the research, they're writing the paper and then feeding it in. And that's a much healthier mechanism for utilizing the tech as opposed to just asking it, hey, tell me about these things. Side note, at Brain.One, what we've done is we will take a scientific paper, feed it into the LLM, and then come up with a summarization of that, and then ultimately generate a health protocol based on that paper. And then that's what we're ultimately, giving away. And so in that context, we didn't ask the paper about, tell me, what are the best, preventative measures for dementia. We're, again, feeding it in and providing at least a framework and a safeguard against the hallucinations. It's not perfect. And so we still have a human in the loop that's verifying every single post, that every protocol that we generate, which is also critical. And that's a technical term. Ultimately, it's a human proofreading the AI, where we also see, a lot of, again, you have AI proofreading AI, and it's garbage on garbage, and it's fairly, it just becomes, obtuse. The data doesn't even make sense at a certain point, or the content doesn't make sense. So we're seeing that. Other areas I'm very optimistic, though, is in the area of health and in the idea of health protocols. What we've been working on is a system that will amalgamate biometric data, so it could be a blood test, biometric data, so it could be things like HRV is an example coming out of your wearables, biomarkers, and then working towards like DNA methylation for epigenetics, and then can essentially recommend you, Jason, a health protocol based on that information that would be tailored to you at this moment in time. You're visiting family, I think you said back east in the snow, so maybe you can't go for a run, but again, these are the things that you could be doing indoors to continue to promote positive health.
Obviously, one of the topics that I think a lot of people are concerned about is it seems like there's a tremendous benefit to AI, to the technology, to the usefulness of it. And as you said, I think being an optimist is super good, because if you can see the benefit, then you can see the negativity, and then you can work around the negativity to continue the positivity. I think a lot of concerned people have is this idea of eventually AI taking human jobs, human innovation. I think it's something even Elon has spoken a lot about. That's where these ideas of like universal basic income come in, because potentially a majority of humans won't have a physical way to generate money. Do you see that? And if not, do you think there are other alternatives where, as you said, AI can be more of a companion to aid the human being? At the same time, it does seem like that technology is increasing very fast, if not exponentially. So even within a short amount of time, like if there is an exponential increase, like how does that begin to look and manifest?
Yeah, I think that you still need someone to manage the machines fundamentally. So, whether it's just for work or for your own edification, the majority of these systems are free or fairly cheap to use. So I always believe you want to come from a perspective of knowledge and education, and understanding how to use these types of systems is absolutely critical. And it is moving so quickly. Even the last year, we've gone from just like single agents to multiple agents, and every listener on the podcast could be doing this right now. So, personally, I feel it's always better to try to understand these things and have an educated position, as opposed to just relying on, either the government or, the technology leaders to make those decisions for you. So I think education is really important in this, kind of in this next phase. I also believe, again, the ability to use these tools is so critical, both on a personal and on a work basis. And so will it eliminate jobs? It certainly will. But again, there's still a need for humans to help manage and support. So I think it's a balancing act on that.
Yeah. With AI, because it is moving so fast, you also have, it comes to mind people like Joe Rogan who kind of have this idea that eventually the machine overtakes the human, that potentially even like the human being, their role is to give way to a new life form, that being AI. I think it's a very fascinating theory. I think there's something fundamentally in me that does not resonate with that, because it also goes back to the nature of consciousness. And I'd be curious of your view, because you have worked with, I mean, one, you're fascinated by consciousness. You have worked with a lot of substances as well, because a lot of that boils down to what is the nature of consciousness. And I think it's something that we use very lightly, that term, like something is conscious, but we don't necessarily, and we will probably never have a full grasp of what that means, because the mind can probably never know itself. But what is your feeling in that realm of, like, is it possible for AI to overtake the human? Is it possible for AI, artificial intelligence, to fully be intelligent in the way that it has a consciousness? Meaning, can consciousness be generated from something without, or is it, loosely speaking, what some people would view too is more like the brain being a receptor, the human being a receptor to something that's coming from the outside? And is that even ever possible to generate within something that's created by a human being?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So, just to first discuss the human consciousness side of the question. So, taking a step back, if you think about the expansion of consciousness, and I think there's a white paper here I've been debating on writing. I think this topic's super fascinating. So, like, if you look at the expansion of human history, how have humans been able to connect to the divine and connect to consciousness, whether in themselves or something greater, whatever you call it, doesn't really matter. And so what we've seen historically was prayer, meditation, were modalities people have used. I think the use of plant medicines are a catalyst that can get humans there much more quickly. And then what we're also seeing right now, again, is expansion of consciousness through technology. And I think of brain-computer interfaces as an example of that. And, specifically, I was with Dr. Galen at Caltech, watching him undergo a clinical trial. And so Galen comes in and he has 3 PEDs on top of his head, where essentially he has 2 neural arrays deployed. And they quite literally are, they screw on an interface that connects his brain, to the internet. And so, around the question of consciousness, what does that actually mean then? And so I think we're really moving into a new paradigm where, again, traditionally we had, the use of breath and prayer and these modalities and plant medicines. And, of course, over the last, 20, 30, 40 years, just an explosion on that front. I do see BCIs as as kind of the next frontier, and what does that mean when your brain is connected to the internet then, relative to your consciousness and your understanding? So I think that is, it's something we're seeing literally right now. And I think it's the making of a great paper. So something I've been sketching out. And then to the second point or question around the consciousness of machines, can they truly attain true consciousness? I mean, I think the capability could be there. It really depends on the definition, but are they truly autonomous? Again, are they just being trained? I mean, that's there's definitely some questions on that front for me, but I think the hypothesis is very interesting, and I know Elon's spoken on this too. I mean, that's where it's the, really the, this hybrid connection of humans and machines, into the technology. I think that probably will become the most pervasive mechanism, and also, potentially a bit of a safeguard.
Kind of circling back to where we started, you mentioned you had worked with huachuma, and I believe you said you'd done a number of dietas. I think if I remember, you said you had worked with Chiricsanango a lot. I think one of the interesting things you mentioned in the other interview I was listening to was that you've worked a lot with the solanaceous family of plants, and that's a group of plants that I think is really relegated. It's often, even when you speak of this idea of plant medicines or psychedelics, those are not even in the foray. Plants like chiricsanango, plants like toei, plants like tobacco, and traditionally these were all considered master plants and plants of the highest order, alongside things like huachuma or ayahuasca. What has that experience been like for you, and how did you end up being drawn to that? Because it's not a very popular path to delve into.
Yeah, the Solanaceae definitely called to me at a pretty early age. So the first experience I had, and again, this was somewhat related to Kuchora and some of his lessons in Toei. But I, in the 90s, I ordered Datura online. And I was still in high school, and ultimately I drank a Datura tea. And that was, that was extremely, I would say, life-changing. And, it's, as you're aware, it's not necessarily it's not really condoned, generally speaking. I mean, it's a certain, path. I think chirics become more and more, a bit more common anyway, but definitely with the Torah. And it was a foray into consciousness I still, to this day, have actually never really seen or reconciled. So I would say that specifically. But that was really the beginning. And, I was quite young. That was probably 16, 17 at the time in that experience. And then over the years, I did a 6-month dieta. This was actually back in 2020. So I was living in Venice, and I was in LA for 10 years. And then the pandemic hit, and I just went screaming out of California to Colorado and settled here in the mountains. And my nervous system was a bit unchecked. And so that was actually my second dieta with Chiric, but I did a 6-month dieta. It was an omni-dose protocol where I would do 3 days of micro and then 1 day of macro. And I did 3 months with Chiric and then 3 months with ayahuasca. And but there was a very specific, measurable output that I was looking for. And again, that was really the stabilization of my nervous system and, going through the pandemic and all of those things. And so, I was working full time and supporting a company and all these things and still skiing every day. But I was on dieta essentially for 6 months and, would just structure my day. I'd have work in the morning, some skiing in the afternoons, and then I would basically do the microdose roughly around 5 to 7 p.m. and then 3 days of micro, 1 day of macro. And Chiric in particular is non-psychedelic, but it is very, it's very physiological. I mean, you feel it in your bones, quite literally. The cuero, pre-Incan natives of Peru, they would the Quero translation is bone chilling, essentially, of Chiric, and that's really what you undergo in that plant in particular. But yeah, I've sat with it a couple of times, and it's definitely one of the master plants that I hold very close and dear. But of course, as you're aware, the Solanaceae go back thousands of years with humans, even in the medieval times, and man drank henbane, belladonna. These were a lot of the psychedelics of the witches of the Moors, and a lot of the kind of earlier psychedelics of medieval Europe were based in the Solanaceae.
I actually just interviewed a really interesting guy. Maybe you've heard of him. His name is Thomas Hatsis. He wrote a really good book called The Witch's Ointment, which was all about the Solanaceous family in medieval Europe.
Yeah. No, but I'll check it out.
Yeah, he's a really interesting guy. I think for a lot of people listening, they're familiar with plant medicine, but there's certainly people who are not. I think for a lot of people, that idea, and I think it would be interesting hearing it from you, also with your scientific background, that idea of working with a plant can somehow teach you or affect your consciousness. Like, these fields used to be very disparate, and yet I think there is a growing crossover between them. What has that journey been like of you? I mean, obviously, it's such big questions and such personal, so whatever you feel like sharing, but how has that helped to teach you about the nature of consciousness? How has that helped to shape your work, your creative aspect, your way of being in this world?
Yeah, I look at plant medicines as being guides of all different types. I have a huachuma here in my living room. Very deep practice with ayahuasca. I also believe ketamine can be a wonderful conduit and a way to connect to the divine. And, of course, that's a non-plant based medicine. But I've seen a lot of really, really great work there personally and in the mental health space, around ketamine as an example. I look at them as, for me personally, it's really been part of my my overall health practice and protocol. I've had very deep dietas with ayahuasca in the jungles, out of the jungles here in Colorado. And then different circles that I've sat with, both indigenous in the case of peyote, and then different musical Santo Daime type churches in LA and so forth. And I've really looked at the work as a mechanism to calibrate and tune my own personal consciousness, and using these plants in different types of modalities on a fairly regular basis. I mean, when I was in LA, we had a monthly song circle that we would sit in more of the daime style of essentially daime style of using the medicines, as opposed to Peruvian, which you're like in the dark in the maloca, they blow out the candle. The Brazilian daime methodologies, where it's like light and airy and everyone's playing music and connecting and so forth. But I've looked at it personally. For me, it's part of just a calibration and a mechanism to continually connect. But of course, you also learn you don't need the medicines at all. You can do that through prayer, meditation, breath. And so that's also a very big learning. But I feel very gifted to have had such strong connections to plants and elders, that I've been able to learn from, through the decades. But that idea of, again, just like, we talked about neuroplasticity in your brain, the people that go and they drink ayahuasca and they see God and they come back and they want to start serving ayahuasca. And I mean, I've lived in LA for decades, and, it's not generally, I find, something you do once and walk away. I think it's just like any other muscle in your body. You're strengthening your consciousness, and it's something you get better at and can improve and can drop in sooner. And a lot of that is very fundamental. It comes down to breath and meditation, starting there, the stillness, and then that really opens up, everything. But that idea that it's a really continual practice is something that I hold true. I also, when I'm here in the summers in Colorado, believe that psilocybin, as an example, is also a performance enhancer. So we do a lot of like microdosing and long trail runs in the mountains, and as profound as that is, then it's also the connection to nature. And so those are generally the things that I come back to: the consciousness, connection to nature, as part of my overall health practice. And I do believe these are very strong microhabits to overall longevity. There's been a number of studies actually around purpose and connection. People who have purpose and connection actually can live 10 to 12 years longer than people that don't. And again, that connection can be to yourself, to nature, to God. It doesn't really matter, as long as you wake up in the morning and you have some purpose and some connection. So again, as a microhabit, that's something that I believe is actually very, very efficacious and potent, and helping humans live longer, more robust lives, whatever it looks like.
Yeah, great. We're almost at an hour and a half, so maybe we'll start to wrap up. Can you speak a bit about your company, Brain.One? How did you come up with that idea? Just speak more about it. What it is, what you're looking to do, how people can get involved in that. Just whatever comes to mind.
Yeah. So quick anecdote. I live here in the mountains, and I broke my clavicle 2 years ago. And I go to the #1 orthopedic in the country. They're called the Stedman Institute. And I walk in, and she does the x-ray, and she's like, "Your clavicle's broken." I was like, "Okay." And she's like, and I was like, what's my health recovery protocol? And she throws me a sling. And so literally it was a mobilization. And I was like, this is it? And she's like, yep, see you in 6 weeks. And I just thought that was it was so striking to me that, again, the number one orthopedic in the country, and this is their healthcare protocol. And so I went back to my network and, within Brain.One, we've got amazing nutritionists. And I was chatting with a couple of them, and they're like, oh, you broke your clavicle, bone broth, collagen, nutrition. And of course, I'm a strong believer, food is medicine. And so I focused on my nutrition. And actually did another modality called PEMF, P-E-M-F, which is a pulse electrical magnetic frequency. It's drawn through the bone. A lot of these modalities used to be like pretty wackadoodle, woo-woo, and now they're like, becoming more and more commonly recognized. And so PEMF would be an example. But long story short, I do this microhabit of PEMF, and I go back to Stedman, and she said, come back in 6. I went back in 4. She does the x-ray. She's like, oh my gosh, your bone is completely healed. What have you been doing? And I was like, oh, doctor, I've been focusing on my nutrition. And she looks at me and she goes, I never would have thought of that. And she said it with a straight face. And that was like one of these epiphany moments. I was like, we absolutely can do better. And so at that moment, I was also building Brain.One, and I knew there was something around the healthcare protocol and that concept. And this started to galvanize it further, and then related, kind of parallel path. I was training a team for the Malibu Triathlon in California, and we were following a healthcare protocol, which basically is a series of microhabits, including nutrition. It can include supplements. It can include measurement, and that's generally how I think of the world. And that's when I had, again, a related epiphany that, okay, there's something here. Humans can follow a structured essentially protocol to improve their health. And that was really the genesis of Brain.One. And so the idea that we can utilize either, they could be existing scientific research like the Lancet 2020 I spoke about earlier. We can run that through our AI and then generate a generic protocol, and then you can essentially connect and then utilize different biometrics, and then it would start to tailor to you, Jason, to help provide microhabits that could, essentially but could at least put you on a path to not getting dementia. And I believe every one of our grandparents and our parents should be following a protocol like this. And so that was the beginning of the company. And we've just been building a database of protocols from there. We've been more focused on the B2B side, focusing on businesses that have these large networks of millions of humans. And so we're seeing tremendous interest, and we're have some massive contracts going into 2026. And that's really exciting. And it's that concept that, again, this structured framework could start to reach millions. And ultimately our vision and mission is to reach 1 billion humans and help them optimize their brain and their biology. And it's through that concept of the structured framework. And then the most important part is behavioral change. And so, going back to one of the points earlier is that, again, let's say 30 to 60% of your gene expression is dependent on your environment and ultimately on the behavior, the things that you do. And we have control there. And every listener, essentially can help control their biology based on, a number of these factors, the things that you do every day. And so I think that's very empowering. And that's also, again, the basis of really what we've been focusing on in our research at Brain.One, and that concept that you can really help humans by providing them an environment to accelerate and improve their health based on behavior change. It doesn't always need to be a pill, doesn't need to be, pharma that, and there's great use cases for those as well. But, ultimately nutrition and the things that you do, and really the basics, circadian regulation, getting, sun in the morning is like, number one for Huberman as an example. So, but that's the concept of Brain.One. And so we've been amassing these, a database of thousands of different types of studies and then protocols. And then the vision is in Q1, we'll be giving a set of these away. And brain is where we started, but we're also razor focused on women's health. Day one, when I was just launching the alpha for Brain.One, we had a doctor approach us, to use this for women's health. And that's really just an area that we're actively looking at pursuing. Why does every woman I know have a autoimmune or a thyroid issue? And so that's another application that we're actively pursuing in PCOS, perimenopause, menopause, and so forth. So how can we help support the women in our lives through these types of protocols as well? So we're very excited about that. Is really kind of the next dimension.
And can individuals work with you or reach out, or you're predominantly focused on businesses?
Been predominantly focused on B2B, but they can absolutely go to the website and enter the wait list. And if they mention you and they have a specific need they're looking for, we're happy to connect them. Again, on the brain health side, hormonal health side, whatever it might be, we have an incredible network of humans and doctors and clinicians. So be happy to help any way we can.
Well, great, Thoryn. Well, thank you so much. Are there any topics we didn't talk about that you'd like to go into before we wrap up?
No, I thought it was a very thoughtful conversation, Jason. I appreciate the work that you do and your dedication to the plants as well. And it was a lovely conversation.
Well, thank you so much. I think it's amazing work you're doing. I think that idea of protocols, knowledge, discipline, lifestyle, nutrition, circadian rhythms, even just very basic but fundamental things, which are time-tested wisdom, time-tested tracks for health, for physical health, for mental health, for spiritual health. And I do think we're in a very interesting time right now where there are a lot of fields coming together which can really give people possibilities to do that in a better way. So thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for sharing. It's been a pleasure. I hope we stay in touch in some manner. If we're able to maybe collaborate in the future, I'd love that. And I really wish you all the best with what you're doing.
Thank you. Appreciate the time, Jason.
All right, everyone. That's it. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I really enjoyed speaking with Thoryn. I think he's doing some really great work. And that's it. As always, if you're interested in working with myself, my colleague Marav Artsy, we have our 2026 calendar up right now on my website. We have some really beautiful opportunities coming up to work more deeply with plants, with plant medicine. So if you're interested in that, you can check out my website at nicotianarustica.org. If you're able to support this podcast, that's always a really big help. Patreon is a beautiful way to help to give back. You can find the link to that in the show notes. As always, thank you so much to the Patreon supporters. And finally, if you're not able to do that, always just simply helping with the algorithms is really beneficial. So if you're viewing this on YouTube, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video, and if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or Spotify, leaving a starred rating and a short review. So that's it. I hope you all enjoyed this conversation. I hope this finds you all well, and I will see you all on the next episode.